Welcome to Tagat Kasech.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to finally be here.
It's my pleasure as well. And I invited you on for you to reflect on Post-Pretoria developments in Tigray because there was a post that you put out on Facebook a couple of days ago that really caught my attention, where you said that some of the developments in Tigray have made you ask some fundamental questions of your connection to Tigray and how your basic assumptions about Tigray were. And I think that is an interesting one because a lot of people, Tigrayans, are also asking those questions. And I thought we would reflect on those. So maybe we could start with that, with you telling us what it is that made you have those conversations with yourself, Kasech.
Thanks. It was a deep post. It was a difficult post to try and write because it's something that I've been wanting to express for a long time. I don't know if people that follow me have probably noticed that I've dropped off a lot since the Pretoria Agreement. And a lot of that has to do with the thinking and the hope that I had pre-Pretoria. So during the war, I think I can say that I was optimistic that even though the worst was happening to the people, that there was still a chance that through the war, through the devastation, through all of the suffering, would come a new future for Tigrayan people. I always kept my political opinions to myself. What I felt about the TPLF, who I felt about, like what I felt about Getachew. And I know I made jokes about loving Getachew and wanting to be, loving him and all of this kind of thing. But it was just, I think, that admiration that I think everybody had. He was a straight shooter. He was somebody that was telling what we felt to be the truth and fighting on the good fight, fighting the fight for the Tigrayans. And a lot of people pre-war, I think, didn't really understand the cause of the war from the ideological perspective. So for me, I always had a bigger picture. I don't speak Tigrinya, and I don't understand completely. So I've always been able to observe from the outside the culture, the community, the political stance, and it's kind of been, it's a passion, but it's also been something that it's like a puzzle that I've always been so interested in trying to untangle. So pre the war, I had a very, very firm opinion that it was from Abi's perspective, this was an ideological war. And from how I saw it, it was the TPLF was also, it was a battle of ideologies. Abi wanting to neoliberalize the economy, set forward democratic reforms, in the Western sense, falling into that trap of kind of a debt trap of aid and everything. And I think something that Meles was very, very, very strong at fighting against, and the TPLF was very strong at fighting against, maintaining that sovereignty for Ethiopia at the start, that Ethiopia had its own way forward, that it had to forge from the bottom up a future for itself. Whereas I always saw that Abiy was taking that easy route out, the one that Meles was resisting, that Western pressure to really neoliberalize, open up the economy and become quote unquote democratic. And for me, before the war, I could see very clearly that the TPLF was so entrenched in the society, and that this ideology is something that was adopted because it was adopted from the ground roots up. It was something that was believed in because it was the people that actually helped build that ideology. So for me, the war was always, from Abiy's side, the genocide itself was a means to an end, meaning that he didn't care what happened in between. He didn't care how many people died. He, in fact, needed to cause the chaos because of the resistance was so strong, because the Tigrayan people, along with the TPLF, were resisting so strongly to that ideological change to preserve their sovereignty, to preserve their culture, to preserve their way of life, and actually, to evolve in the way that was going to be in the best interest of Tigray. So during the war, as I said, pre-Pretoria, I had still had this really deep glimmer of hope that although I didn't necessarily disagree with a lot of the TPLF ideologies, I agreed with some of the treatment and the way that it was being implemented on the ground. So I had hoped that some change would come out of it, and I really had hoped that Tigray had and would hold on to that sovereignty, and that idea that their ideology needed to come from Tigray's brains, basically, not something that was going to be implemented and put on top of them. So after Pretoria, well, as the agreement was actually signed, and just before the agreement was signed, I started to, again, I don't understand Tigrinya, but I have this ridiculous sense of being able to take little bits of pieces from everywhere and make a bigger picture. So I had started to kind of sense that a lot of the diaspora groups that were advocating for Tigray were very happy to outsell that ideology for peace to happen. And I remember a few conversations that people I'd been privy to. I wasn't in any advocacy groups, but people would on the side kind of share what they had heard. And I had realized very quickly that the Westerners were very happy to give Abiy a scolding, or tell him off, if Tigray bent and if Tigray adapted the new ideology that Abiy wanted to implement. So again, I think, as I said, for Abiy, the war was a means to an end. For the Eritreans and the Fano, it was hate. For me, I will say that Isaias has spent a whole 20 building a generation to hate Tigrayans. The Fano, very similar. So for them, he needed them to cause the chaos enough so that he could go in and make this change. And I started to realize just before Pretoria, and I actually messaged Getachew, and I don't know if he read it, and I don't know if anything came of it, but I warned him. I was like, I'm really, really scared you guys are being sold under the bus. I'm very, very scared that whoever's advocating on behalf of you is advocating to demolish the TPLF's ideology and to change everything and, to basically implement whatever the West wants. So when the agreement was signed, I know most people were happy. Most people were like, finally, there's peace and this is a really good forward step. I read the agreement 3 times and I burst into tears each time because I just saw that as this was not a means to an end. This was not what we thought it was going to be. This was a surrender. This, to me, the agreement flagged a surrender to any TPLF ideology or pre-war ideology, like ideological war. Abiy had won. So, and I don't know if people still see it like that. Again, I don't understand Tigrinya, so I don't hear the narratives, I don't hear the bickering, and I don't hear a lot of the, the points that people are making based on, they think is on principle, but without this like deeper understanding. So I don't know if I'm completely wrong here, but that's how I saw the agreement. I saw it as a surrender, not only for peace, because we needed to surrender, the bombs needed to stop, the guns needed to stop, but it was a flagging to the West that we're ready to change and we're ready to change ideologies. Now, whether that is the truth and whether that is what caused the friction between the two factions of the TPLF and the breakaway, I don't know. Like, that's just my best guess. But from that point, I realized I'm saying these things that this isn't a good thing. Like, we've lost. Like, essentially, we've lost humans for our ideology, and now our ideology is going to be changed. And I have no problem with the evolution and changing of, the footing of what was making up the Tigray political scene, because I think there was definitely room to move and there was definitely things that could have been adapted and changed, and there could have been a brand new Tigray that was formed out of this, and that was my hope. But when it happened, I just thought, this is not going to happen. There isn't going to be the hope and the evolution and the revolution that I thought I was hopeful that might have come out of this war. Like, I had hoped that the leaders who had been through the suffering, who had been through the torture, would come out of it with humility and realize that, okay, there are things we need to change. We need to be Tigray focused. We need to be building Tigray. We need to be stopping whatever kind of corruption there may be. We need to make sure that our justice systems are well. We need to make sure that we are supporting our farmers. And as it was playing out, it was like the complete opposite thing was happening. Aid was being stolen, and, women were getting raped and tortured, and there was no justice for them. There was no legal system that was put in place to protect them. Things didn't changed for the better, things did change for the worst. And yeah, that's why I wanted to mention and talk about the pre-Pretoria stuff, because that really broke my heart. I truly believed that through the war there would be a light at the end of the tunnel and change would happen and improvements would happen. But it made me question, was I wrong? And so if I was so wrong in reading what I thought could be possible, am I wrong in reading then what the society is and what I thought Tigray was?
Well, I mean, you say that you don't speak Tigrinya, and so you might have missed something, but I don't think you have. I don't think there is any nuance that you have failed to capture. But to play the devil's advocate, as they say, one thing is that you say, for instance, you thought there was an ideological divide between the TPLF and Abiy regime before the war, and that was part
Mm-hmm.
of the reason why the whole thing happened. And I interviewed Samhar Meles, the daughter of the previous prime minister of Ethiopia, a couple of days ago. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the points she made was that actually even the TPLF were ready to make the ideological adjustments that Abiy made to placate the West. So to the extent that there was an ideological difference between the TPLF and the Abiy or the Prosperity Party in general, it was more apparent than real. There was nothing. They were ready to do everything that Abiy went on to do. So that is one thing in terms of the
Okay.
other viewpoints. The other thing is about the Pretoria Agreement. You say that you read it 3 times and each time you cried, and I understand, and you thought it was a surrender. And
Mm-hmm.
what people say about that is that the Tigray negotiators in South Africa didn't have an option. That Tigray was losing on the war front,
Mm-hmm.
and they were in a position where they had to sign literally anything that was put in front of them because of the desperation. One, from a military point of view, and second, the Ethiopian regime was using starvation as a weapon, and it was
Mm-hmm.
openly admitted that starvation
Mm-hmm.
was being used as a weapon. And the Tigrayan representatives had to be the adults in the room and say, "All right, we're going to sign anything so that food could get in to Tigray." So that is the second point that I want you to reflect on what you think about that viewpoint. And the other is that you say they sold ideology and justice, and people will say that the reason by they, I mean the Tigray or the TPLF in general, is that they lost the war, and when you lose war, there are consequences. One of which is you drop your ideology.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can see if that's the case, I do think that there was room for adjustment. So actually I want to go back to the agreement. Again, I'm not an expert. I wasn't there, and there are a lot of nuance and there are a lot of bits that, I do miss. I don't know what Semhal is. I don't know what she's referencing. Like I'm not privy to those conversations. So I don't know, that if that is true, that the TPLF was willing to completely change their ideology. And if so, why wasn't that mentioned earlier? Like, why was that not a discussion point pre the war? Like people can say in retrospect, yes, they were the actions from the outside, the actions didn't appear that they were ready to change their ideology and to adapt to the PP party, like the Prosperity Party's ideology, because if they did, they would have signed up with him when he gave them the option, and they didn't. So I don't know. I can't say yes or no, I agree with that. As far as I see it, I don't see that as the case. But again, that's because there are gaps in my knowledge, and I'll be humble enough to admit that. Again, the pushing of the point that you said about, they were pushed to sign any kind of agreement. I can see that, and I can understand that would be the pressure of the West. But were the West then, like from their perspective, were the West also weaponizing food and aid, or are they saying that they would just continue to allow Abiy to weaponize the aid? I don't because I don't really
Well,
understand
they
like
were,
what.
just to give you more information about that. I think it was the American ambassador or the head of USA Aid. I could be wrong, but a couple of weeks before they signed the agreement, he went on TV on one state channel, Ethiopian, and said that from the Ethiopian regime to send aid to Tigray, the TPLF would have to withdraw from Amhara and Afar. So they were open about that. They were open about the
those two
fact that
things were,
aid was being conditioned on
Yeah.
military activities of the TPLF.
I mean, okay, I can understand that. But then, like, to take them out and to stop look, I could go on for ages and critique the West and their methods. I don't want to really get into that because it is a can of worms that could just go on forever. But one thing in particular that made me cry and made me upset is, and I still do stand by the firm belief that if the TPLF were very clearly ready to drop their ideology, I believe much more that this was a war of ideology still. I still believe it, even though these points that have been made. I still believe the West wanted that developmental, I can't even remember the actual, the term for it at the moment. But they wanted free access. They wanted things to change. They wanted control over Ethiopia. And to have control over Ethiopia, you need all states to be in line. And there must have been some resistance to that for them to come so hard on the TPLF. And so it's all well and good to say, yes, they were ready to change. If they were so ready to change, why would they have needed to go so hard on them? I don't get that. But one part that made me very upset, apart from the ideology, is that they were asking Tigrayans to lay down their weapons, and they had to. But so they had to lay down their weapons. There was no conditions. Well, the conditions are kind of, assumed that the other side's the aggressors would. But in reality, and the ENDF could not man the borders of Tigray, and the threats were still there. So the internal borders from Tigray. So there was still an internal threat from Amhara region encroaching into Tigray. There are still, as we know, there are still occupied territories that they're not leaving. And it didn't seem reasonable that they were asking for this to happen without any, and I don't know what the conversations were, but how can you ask the Fano to leave and tell Tigrayans they're going to be safe with no defense? They cannot defend themselves. And so there was no stipulation that we will put in peacekeepers. So that was one of the major things that made me upset. How can a military cannot turn on its own civilians, even though it happens in Ethiopia. That's happening. That happens. It's not. But the West can't sign to that. The Westerners cannot sign that their military will turn inwards. Our Australian military would never, ever face its guns inwards. It's always face your guns out. You're there to protect your country, not to defend against your own people. So one of the things that makes me sad, and one of the things I posted about probably, I think in February or something, is that the actual agreement itself is what I feel is failed. And I don't know what was said, and I'm not there. I don't know how much of a corner there was, but if it was a negotiation, I would have thought that some protective measures to keep Tigray safe from internal threats would have been made or suggested, such as UN peacekeepers. But these kinds of terms don't seem to have been thrown around. So then how can you implement an agreement that is essentially not going to... So if you return the IDPs, how are you going to implement that if they're not going to be safe? And there is no safeguards, because in theory, the ENDF cannot turn from and protect the Tigray-Amhara border. It needs to have externals. And I think that's one of the things that really was bugging me for a very, very long time.
What I think one thing that has become very clear is that not much thought has gone into the agreement, into the text of the agreement. If you read the text, you could see that it was hastily prepared, and you could clearly see that there wasn't much planning for it, and they didn't think about how they were going to enforce, for instance, the implementation, how they were going to enforce the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, of Fano militia from Western Tigray and Southern Tigray also. I think from the point of view of the international community, if we could call them that, the people who were there as mediators, what they wanted was to silence the guns, as they said, and continue the war on Tigray by other means. This has become very clear, because they clearly wanted Abiy to win and the TPLF to wither away. I think there is no doubt about that. That was the thinking from the Americans and the Europeans' point of view.
Yeah. But so this is where I get that question of, well, that's where I get a bit confused. Well, how can the TPLF then have been ready to change ideologies, what did they hate so deeply about them if it wasn't that their ideology and their way of developing the society was so grossly different to Abi's?
I don't think it's entirely down to ideology. I think the more significant factor is because the Westerners knew that the TPLF was seen as there was hostility toward the TPLF across Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, yeah.
So regardless of what the ideology of the TPLF was, the Westerners or the Americans didn't want the TPLF to have much of a say in Ethiopian politics. I think that was the thinking. I don't think it was down to ideology, and I don't think they believe that Abiy would be much different in terms of ideology. I think the Prosperity Party is more or less the same to the TPLF on important matters. I don't think there is a clear blue water between the two. I might be wrong. So
I just see that he's opened up the markets he's opened up the Western markets. He's opened up preemptively privatized commodities that the TPLF or the EPRDF or the older generation would have probably held on to within the state structure a little bit longer. And I think it's a question that does pop up and come into my mind. I have the same arguments with my stepfather, who's very, very pro-Western. I'm just very of the mind that the West is not always right, regardless of whether you grow up there or not. So he's said to me, well, what more do you think that they want? And like, if the market isn't that great, well, I think it comes down to control. And I think it comes down to actually having people in your pocket, destabilize. It comes into geopolitics as well, destabilizing the Belt and Road Initiative. Like it's sometimes the West, from my understanding, wants things that doesn't necessarily look to on the surface of like to others as something that's a big deal. But at the end of the day, they get more power and control. So power and control might be more sufficient than monetary value. So what I'm trying to say is, like, I think they wanted him to. I do think Abiy's different. The key difference is the privatization and the assets and the opening up of assets and allowing foreign companies in to actually start to gain assets, start to gain money from the Ethiopian resources, something that hasn't been available before. And I think, and that might be where my terminology ideology comes in, because I think economic term, like, is the economic ideology is also very much part of the political ideology. So I think when I talk about ideology, I do encompass not just a change in political structure, because in political structure, perhaps it's not going to be too different. The difference between Abiy's rule and say the TPLF's rule, maybe politically it's not too different, but on two matters there are very key differences. The economic policies are very different, the privatization, the opening up, the allowing foreign countries in. But also I believe that there is Abiy has an idea that the West very much want to grasp onto, and that is the removal of the nation state idea. And that a nation of nations, essentially. The West is very much of the idea that Ethiopia should become a nation state under one identity, one language group, and that is their ideology. So when I'm talking about ideologies, I'm not necessarily talking just that political landscape of how we're going to do it. I'm talking about the whole encompassing thing. And from my understanding and where I find it very hard to then ever to critique and to say quite negative things about, because I don't want to take sides, and I want to make that very clear here. I'm not going to say, I'm pro-TPLF, I'm against them. I'm not. I have a belief system, and it happens to align with the fact that I think the TPLF would have been much a stronger opponent to maintaining the nations and nationalities' rights, sovereign rights within Ethiopia. The federal, regardless of whether it played out how it was supposed to play out in the last 30 years pre the war. I think the belief that they have, and I don't know again if I'm right, if that's what they were willing to bend to, but I believe that they would not have changed the constitution to allow one nationality, basically building the nation state, building the empire, building what Abiy is trying to do, which is Ethiopia in one identity form, one nation state, one identity. Like, I don't know the language. I don't know who the dominant party is going to be and what he sees that to be. I don't know what he sees the dominant language to be. But I think that's the key difference, that I think the West was agitated and would still be agitated with the TPLF, allowing each state to potentially succeed or to move on and to become an independent state. I think that's where their push is against the TPLF. And I think that's perhaps part of the reason. I don't know, again, like, I don't hear the rhetoric. I don't know why Getachew hates them so much. I don't know what's happened. But from what I can see is the TPLF moved perhaps away from being such an Ethiopianist focus and more to, well, we need to control our state. And Getachew has perhaps aligned with Abiy's ideology in that we just need to rebuild Ethiopia, have one Ethiopian image, and let's just be Ethiopians again. Whereas I think the sentiment internally, and definitely my hopes, was that those conversations of not necessarily full independence, but a change in the structure, the Ethiopian structure, may have come out of the war. And I think that's where the West was very, very strong and wanting to destroy TPLF. And that's the part that makes me worry, and, you know, makes me think that there's much more to it than just, you know, TPLF was ready to bend. I don't see that, because there are so many differences that aren't just democratic, for example.
Well, I perfectly see where you're coming from, Kasech, and I actually tend to agree with a lot of what you said. But something that, you know, some people might say, and maybe we're dwelling on this for more than we should, is, well, so for instance, you said that you're not privy to the conversation that I had with Meles. One of the points she made was that the TPLF had actually promised the Americans and the Europe that they would be happy to privatize. So the privatization thing going on by Abiy now was something that the TPLF would have done anyway. And apart from privatization, on every other aspect, there is no difference between the PP and the TPLF. So they are hostile to media. They are hostile to a lot of other things. Both are the same, which is why many people say it has become easier for the TPLF and the PP to now align in some sense, because they more or less they have the same views on matters. So that is one of the reasons why people are very suspect about the belief that ideology was the reason for the war. And they tend to say that actually it was more personal hostility that caused the war more than anything deeper. So that is the first. But anyway, I think we could debate on this the whole day. But the agreement happened. And one of your bone of contention seems to be that you have been let down by the TPLF post-Pretoria. I
wouldn't say just the TPLF. I think I would be I think it's right to say that I'm let down by both. And I think that's a letdown from my own expectations rather than the reality, perhaps. So my own expectations that change would happen, that other voices would be heard, that, you know, perhaps other political opponents, political parties would actually have a say in the way Tigray would be shaped and formed. And also, one of the main things is that I don't think there was anything wrong. And I know it hasn't been changed, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the federal level, the ethno-federalism, because essentially I see Tigrayans' culture, their identity, everything needs to be preserved. And I think any other system, any other setup would have actually disintegrated the Tigrayan identity, something that's been going on for millennia. So, and I think for me personally, like, I think that would be the biggest shame to the world, not just for the world itself. Like, the world doesn't really care, but it's that disintegration of Indigenous rights, and identities right around the world. The West has abolished nearly every Indigenous identity, and Tigrayans are they have their own history, and I don't want to see that ever erased. It's your identity, it's my children's identity. You know, it's something that I think would be erased under Abiy. It would be erased. It was meant to be erased by the Fano. It was meant to be erased by Eritrea. Like, they wanted to erase the people. Abiy himself I don't necessarily, as I said, I think the war was a means to an end to get his power, to consolidate his power and to change and to put in whatever vision that he has. Like I see him a little bit as a mix between Haile Selassie and Napoleon. Like he's just got an image. He just wants his image to be upheld, and he wants everybody to love him. But he also has a vision, and he wants that. And come hell or high water, he will get that rolled out. Again, I think the West is still playing behind with Abiy, and I don't agree that there isn't still ideological changes to come. I don't think they agree to the nation. They don't agree to the situation in Ethiopia. They don't. Sorry, my internet's just saying it's trying to connect. I don't know if I cut out. Can you still hear me?
I think it's fine. Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily say that I feel like the TPLF necessarily let me down. I think the war let me down. I think the fact that Tigrayans did not get the right to choose their future, whether they wanted to be independent or not. A referendum might not be right now. And a lot of people have said that, and a lot of people argue that. A lot of people who think that, Tigray could be its own state do argue that perhaps this isn't the right time. What I think disappointed me is that those questions and that pride that Tigray could maintain its identity, could maintain its culture, could maintain its sovereignty, could actually become something greater than outside the vortex of Ethiopia. That conversation stopped, and those dreams stopped. And the youth, or the middle generation, your age, my age, have not been able to actually put forward their voice and say, this is what we want for our future. And I think that's the part that really disappoints me more than anything. And that regardless if that's Getachew, or regardless of whether that's the TPLF faction, or if you just call them both the same, I don't, pre-schism, essentially. That's what I think disappointed me the most. And that's where that post all comes back to. I had believed that through war, the identity would have been the first thing to be preserved. And by aligning with Abiy now, Getachew himself, like, I was very, very late in the, I'm not going to criticize him. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I really, really, really wanted him to succeed. And I really wanted him to be able, but I didn't know what was being said. I didn't know if he was saying, hey, let's just change a little bit, guys, and then we can preserve our identity. I don't know. But for me, once you turn to Abiy, it means you've agreed that your Indigenous rights, your right to self-determination, your right to be a society that is independent in thought, in culture, has all been given up, because I don't see that, Abiy respects those rights and those sovereignty, and that sovereignty of each nation and nationality. And yeah, does that make sense? I think necessarily the TPLF let me down, but what let me down is that fight was so quickly doused, and that fire was so quickly put out inside the people, that the hope, it seems now that everything's hopeless. Like, we just either need to bend either way. And that middle generation, the generation that will need to take over from all of this, is not being heard. And that's where my disappointment came, because I had hoped through the war, like I said, change would come and enlightenment would come, and people would be able to band together, and the unity would stay intact, because the common goal was that our sovereignty and that our identity needed to be preserved. And that seems to have been lost in the rollout and the implementation of whatever agreement or not agreement, whatever it is. It doesn't seem to have happened. And again, maybe I'm thinking I'm combining too many things, but again, I feel like that's that is an ideology as well. And that's something that, I would hope that TPLF wasn't willing to give that part of their ideology up. But I don't know. Like, again, it's really difficult for me to sometimes comment on things, because I don't know what they're saying, and I just kind of have to follow the trends.
Well, I don't think they're saying anything that you haven't understood or you haven't heard. But I think this is where your views become very relevant, Kasech, because, of course, in a lot of senses, you are deeply Tigrayan, but there is a sense in which you are an outsider, in the sense that you could see things from the vantage point of being non-partisan. You're only interested in the continuity of the Tigray nation. And the sense I got reading one of his posts is that you think everything in Tigray has become partisan and to the detriment of Tigray. And you make the point that it has become very, very difficult, even for you now, to make a point without being construed as supporting one faction or the other. Why has it come to that, if you have some thoughts on that?
I don't know if you saw the follow-up post I did after that. And I call it cadre mentality, and I don't mean that in the typical sense that, people accuse people of being TPLF cadres or this cadre or that cadre. I take it in the sense that I've explained this before. It's hard to try and verbalize, so please bear with me if I'm stumbling through. But through trauma and through just pure desperation, so whether it's a war or it's a personal trauma and it's a personal, event, people look for value and meaning in the world and in the society, and they try and band together to find people of a like mind to comfort them, to ease them, to support them through this trauma. And I think from what I've been seeing is, and just what this is going to cause a lot of contention, I know, because I'm trying not to bear people and put people into boxes, but I think it would be unwise to say that there wasn't some kind of cadre mentality already happening in Tigray and TPLF, not enforced, but encouraged by the TPLF members in Tigray and wider Ethiopia during the, EPRDF era. I think it would be silly to ignore that there were people that were using their privilege or their connections to TPLF as a means to an end to pull themselves to collect and combine, as a collective identity, but also to get a benefit out of society. So, for example, I don't know, and people may not agree with me, but during the war, I made sure that I wasn't just trying to understand Tigray's point of view. I really, really wanted to understand the point of the Oromo people and why and what it is that got them to hate the TPLF so much. Like, what is it that got them to really, really despise the TPLF and then in turn say it was all Tigrayan people? And so what I understood is that a few people, and it can be a few people that ruin it forever, a few people in that traumatized sense that were trying to create an identity for themselves after the long-standing war became kind of cadres or self-made cadres. I don't think that there's like an indoctrination kind of process back in the Soviet Union where they would indoctrinate people and they would force them. I think that these people became self-made cadres in a sense. They aligned very closely. Their whole identity and their whole meaning and validity of who they were was to the cause of the TPLF. But they use that to their advantage throughout the country to, on a minor level, traumatize or scare people to get what they wanted. So I've heard stories of people being like, give me that land. I want to buy that land from that farmer. I want that land from that farmer. And there's people saying, no, we're not going to do it. And instead of, whether it's true or not, using that fear tactic of, well, I'm from the TPLF, so I'm going to take it. And I don't know. Like, again, this is speculation. This is just from the stories that I've heard. But I feel like that kind of mentality was, if that was what people are telling me is what happened, so I can only believe their stories of what they observed outside of Tigray. If that was happening outside of Tigray, I can only imagine that this was happening inside of Tigray as well. So that people would be like using their privilege, their point or their connection point or their past connection and being like, oh, well, I'm connected to the government, so just give me what I want. And I don't know, like I could very much just be accusing people of crimes that I'm not going to put names to crimes because names to things, but I can just imagine that this kind of mentality was happening and that people were taking advantage of their either actual connection to the TPLF or a perceived connection that they had. So outside of Tigray, it may have just been a perceived connection that, well, they're Tigrayan, so they must have a connection to the TPLF. So then they're going to be able to get what they want. May as well just give it to them anyway. So this kind of, I think, culture had come out of the trauma. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, I think people create these ideas and these identities for themselves as a way to survive. What I think has made it difficult now to talk is that's become very raw again. The emotions have come very raw. People have become very protective. They are in having a traumatic response. They are going through a lot of emotional changes. There's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of things that have, you know, damaged the psyche of everyday people online, diaspora, internally. I don't probably get comments so much from people internally because, you know, my videos were during the war. There's no internet. I don't perceive that I'm very well known inside of the actual Tigrayan population, but I mean, like the state, maybe outside of Tigray itself. But from what I can see is, so whenever I would talk, if I said anything negative, I got accused of hating Tigray. So this is the partisan part. Like, you hate TPLF, so therefore you're hating Tigray. Then I was like, well, hang on, I'm just critiquing what I see, like something that I think they could have done negatively, and we should be able to freely question these things. And I was thinking to myself, people are not questioning, like it's very much in the comfort of, and then I thought, like, this is a trauma response, like it's in the comfort of the people that you know you're going to try and protect and become emotional about. But then I started to critique Getachew, and the same thing happened. So, you know, I got accused of hating Getachew, and I got accused of, you know, just not wanting Tigray to grow now. Like, you're against Getachew, so therefore you don't want Tigray to grow. You don't want the best for Tigray. And it's kind of like, regardless of whether you're on, like, people have been forced, because mentally, for the last, you know, for survival reasons, they've had to pick a side. But now that that's over, they're still picking sides. And it doesn't matter, for me, it doesn't matter whether you're following TPLF or you're following Getachew. People are, for some reason, blinded. They don't want to see and have these open communications. And I think that's a psychological impact of generations and generations of war, survival mode, survival guilt, you know, like I said, the trauma bond, trauma relationships. It's a very difficult space to try and explain what I'm thinking. But I think it became isolating, because you can't have an opinion that is nuanced. It's not just a symptom of Tigray, it is a symptom of the world. The world is very much like this. It's the Twitter space, you know, you're either with us or against us. It's the American bipartisan, you know, you're either a Democrat or a Republican. Like, I come from Australia, which is a very different culture to that as well. Like, there's a much more, it's not as fractionated. I felt very, and I feel very, like, things have become so emotionally charged, and regardless of what side you're on, Getachew and TPLF are both playing into those emotions to get their own agenda across. And that is dividing the people more than the voices that are trying to say, pause, let's think of what actually makes us Tigray, and let's think of what actually unites us. What is it that were the foundations of our society that brought us together? Like, what were the values that we all shared? Nobody is able to actually, those voices, the voices that want to say these things, are being completely drowned out, because it's much easier to bind to the emotive people of the party that you follow, because that gives you value and that gives you a sense of belonging. And I think that's why it's become really, really hard for me to speak out. And that's why I feel disconnected now, because I don't want to take sides. I'm not a kind of person that ever wants to take sides. I want to just be able to say, hey, as humans and as Tigrayans, look at what unites us, look at what keeps us together. What are the shared and collective values and beliefs that we had around our identity and our culture? And again, this all comes back down to my belief that there is an ideological difference in preserving the Tigrayan identity, the Oromo identity, any identity outside of this colloquial Ethiopian nation state that's trying to be built. And I just think that it's very difficult now to hear voices that are wanting change through a united Tigrayan effort.
Well, I think maybe a marginally relevant point to raise in terms of ideology, Kasech, is whether it would have been possible for the TPLF to sustain a different ideology in a situation where Tigray is entirely dependent on Ethiopia for aid. Not Ethiopia per se, but on the international community. But everything gets through to Tigray through Ethiopia. So Tigray is in a bit of a in a bit of a bind when it comes to its geographic location and everything.
Of course.
So whether in principle it would have been possible, I think that is something to maybe worth reflecting on. But more broadly, in this regard, Kasech, you made the point that maybe I don't want to put words into your mouth, you'll correct me, but you have given up on everything except the Tigrayan Orthodox Church. You say that you have pinned your hope on them. And the sense I got is that you think they are doing something right that nobody else is doing. Maybe we could reflect on that as well.
I think maybe that's a little bit of words in my mouth because I don't know exactly always what they're doing. I said that my soul feels very close to the church, and that's a very personal feeling rather than necessarily a belief in what the church is doing is right or wrong. As far as the church goes, though, from what I perceive, like I had a very good relationship with Abuna Salama when he lived in Australia. He and I would talk very, very often, very, very openly about our belief and our dream for Tigray and the Tigrayan identity. And that's probably led me more to, it's more of a spiritual connection that I say. So I enjoy church. I enjoy the service. I enjoy Kadasi. Like I enjoy being around there. So that's a very personal connection through into the Tigrayan identity that I think I've grown through. But to talk about them, and I don't necessarily, and I don't get the time to talk to Abuna Salama as much as I would like to in now. So I don't have that deep connection point, that we used to be able to just talk freely about Tigray. But I do think now that you mention it and you put it into my head, this is going to just come off the top of my head kind of thought. It's not a very well through thought, but I'd like to reflect longer. But I do think that there is some validity in, from what I perceive they're trying to do, which is to maintain that identity and to maintain that history and to maintain the culture of Tigray and the values and to promote those shared values. So I don't know exactly if that's what they're doing, but I do think that they have a role to play in that. And a lot of people will criticize church leaders having anything to do with politics. And that is very understandable given the history of how the church was so entangled. Well, it was entangled with the building of the empire. You know, you go back 400 or 500 years, Yukona Amlak and all of those historical figures was very much entangled with, the church was very much entangled with, we're going to build this identity. We're going to build the Amhara identity. We're going to, acquire lands under the name of the Orthodox Church. So I can understand it is a very contentious point, and I don't necessarily think that church leaders should be making political decisions, but commenting on the politics and comment at this stage, commenting on what the politicians are doing and trying to build peace between them and trying to keep the people together. I do think there is a role for that to play, because there is no other civil society that is, as far as I know, there very well could be. And I don't see there's any other civil societies that are calling for that unity and that are calling for those shared values to come through and that belief system. I don't want people to be trapped in, how do I put this? I want people to be able to be free to practice their religion if they are a religious person. I don't want people to be trapped into saying that they must be, I'm Tigrayan, so I must be Orthodox, so therefore I must follow the dogma of every single thing. But I do think there is value in the church teachings, and I do think there is value in maintaining a spiritual connection as a society. I think in the West, one of our biggest problems is we have drifted so far away from any kind of morality that was revolved around a church or around a religion that we have lost a lot of our value systems. And I think that plays out very clearly in our mental health crises, this is in the West, in, our people's identity crisis. I think because they haven't had anything to really hold on to as an individual to, keep their spirit contained. I think that's a big problem. So I would never want Tigrayans to completely Westernize in the sense that they're going to lose what's preserved them for the last 1,700 years, 2,000 years almost, like if you think about Tigray being one of the very first one of the very first regions to adopt Christianity. This is what's preserved the society for so long. But I also wouldn't want them to be held back on progress and development just because of their religious affiliations. Does that make sense? So I think there is definitely a role for the church, and I think there is definitely a role for people to maintain their spirituality. And I wouldn't want people to, say, I'm going to modernize means I need to lose my religion. I don't think that has to be the case. I think you can modernize and you can change politics and you can change the way society is structured without losing your religious grounding and your spirituality. And that's probably where I'm perceiving the church's role is playing a part in preserving that part of the identity. And not necessarily and again, I'm Christian by choice. I was born and raised a Catholic. I never really attended church, but I was always a Catholic, but then I drifted out of things and I learnt about all the different religions. I learned about Islam as well. I learnt about everything. I found my home in the Orthodox Church. I felt my soul really connected to that. I felt my insides were, happy. To sound really ridiculous. But again, I don't necessarily prescribe to all of the dogma, and I don't actually agree with some of the things that the church do say and do, and I don't know whether it's the church leadership, but for example, there are examples of women that have been ostracized or been told they have to be rebaptized from countryside keshes that have said, you're no longer pure because you were raped. These are things that are damaging. These are things that are damaging the society and the culture, and they need to change and adapt. And I don't know whether that's the individual, that's the church itself, or if that's individual interpretations of what the religion is, or I'm not sure. So I'm not saying they are the answer to everything. I think they are part of the solution, and they should definitely be involved. What I was going to say before, and I interrupted my own thought pattern. It's not just the voice of the Orthodox that needs to be heard too. There are Muslims in Tigray, and there has been Islam in Tigray for a very, very long time. And one of the most redeeming parts of Tigray, and the part that I fell in love with the most, that I probably don't talk about as much, and I don't know if it was just the environment that I was in and the people that I was, I was interacting with, but that brotherhood between either Muslims and Christians in Tigray is something that I was just in awe of. So the Islamic voice should never be ignored either. They are very much part of the culture. Their religion is very much part of the society and the culture, regardless of whether the Orthodox are the dominant religion. There has been, from my understanding, a very long history of Islam in Tigray as well. Well, there is one of the oldest mosques in Africa is found there. So, and I think those shared values between Christianity and Islam is what upheld the society and maintained it for so long. So those shared values should be pushed forward together, regardless of whatever religious sect you're part of.
Well, I caught you off guard with that question.
You did, but I still went down.
But I think you are capable of thinking on your feet. So it was good that I did that, because you gave us this wonderful insight into how you see religion. And it's interesting because in my younger days, I was under the impression that religion was completely evil. But now with aging, I think I'm having to revise that point of view. And also interesting point that you mentioned Islam as well. I think there is a tendency in Tigray and discourse generally to underplay the role of Islam, when in fact it's a major religion in Tigray, and it has played a major role in the history of Tigray. So that was a wonderful reflection, and thank you. But another point, and we're coming towards the end, Kasech. You said that he had gone under the radar, I should say, and the reason is because he didn't want to cause any controversy, because he didn't want to say what you truly felt, because you thought it could be perceived in different sorts of ways, and it might cause problems and all that. And that is a live debate in Tigray circles now. How do we approach the whole thing? Because there is tension, and if you say one thing or another, people are going to perceive it in different ways, as partisan, as you supporting one faction or the other. And because people don't want to do that, because people don't want to add burden to Tigray generally, they have gone under the radar like he did. But of course, that is not the right approach. Maybe people should speak up what they think. But it is a difficult balance to find. What do you say and what do you withhold and how do you speak? What kind of words do you use? And it looks like that you have thought a lot about that, about what the manner of communication should be. Could you reflect on that a little bit? Again, I'm putting you on the spot. This has become a habit for me, but
No, that's okay. I like these on the spot questions. I'll either sink or fail. I mean, I'll either sink or float, it. And either way, I guess for me, I don't necessarily have an ego when it comes to caring what people think. Like, if I was the kind of person that really cared what everybody thought of, I didn't say things, particularly, as you said, I didn't want to cause a rift. I didn't not say it though, because I cared what people think. So what I'm trying to say is that I have an ethical system within myself that is to tell the truth no matter what, if you can, But I used to be very, very, in my younger days, just tell the truth and it doesn't matter what the consequences are. Again, as you said, you reflect on religion as you age. As I've aged, I've gone, well, sometimes the truth needs to be said in a way that can be digestible and isn't offensive to everyone. So before I would say what I thought and not care. I think I got through the war saying what I thought about Abby and not caring. After the war, I realized that there are consequences to what you say. Like, one of those major consequences is I am very, very aware that I possibly could not go to Ethiopia. Like, I haven't returned to Tigray. I know many people have. I don't know whether I can or not, because I said things that were so truthful against Abby that I don't know whether I'm flagged. I don't know. Like, it would be very egotistical for me to say, oh, I'm very well known and I'm famous and people are going to recognize me on the street. I don't think that, but I do think there's a risk to my safety and it's probably not the right thing to say. So that you have to say things. You have to say things with balance. But I think one of the things that is lacking from political circle, and whether it's political or social, and I don't really know, because I do see people having healthy discussions. Again, like I said, I sit in many Tigrayan events and I don't actually know what's going on, but I can read the passion and the energy, and I feel like people are having respectful debates. So I don't know if debating is like a part of the culture so much. Like, it's probably something that I perceive, people can have a healthy argument and not let it impact them. But one of the things that allows people in the West, one of the things that I do admire about the Western societies, maybe not so much in America now, but the original, idea of Western democracy, was that you could have a debate in Parliament and you could very clearly oppose each other, but the idea was to come up with a solution. And I don't know if that culture or that fundamental, like those fundamental beliefs, are shared at the moment. If they are shared, they're not encouraged, because I think people, again, back to that kind of cadre trauma bonding, trying to find a reason, a place where they belong, they're not allowing that kind of healthy discourse to happen. But emotionally, they're not able to allow that to happen because they are so connected to whatever their belief system is or their party is or their ideology is. So it may be preventing people from being able to have those conversations. But I don't think it's right. I do think that people need to be speaking up more. I decided to come here today, and to break my silence and to actually come on media, because I thought there's no good having these ideas if I'm not going to actually share them. And not that I want to be a leader. I don't want to be a politician. I think I was accused of and isolated a lot during the war from certain circles because they believed that I had a white savior complex, that I wanted to take over Tigray, that I wanted to just, impose my views. And I didn't. I'm not like that person. I'm not that person. That's probably one place where my ego does, get a bit hurt, and I do care what people say, because that's not who I am. I care very, very deeply for the identity, and I want that to be maintained and preserved. So where was I going with this? I was saying that I do think people need to be able to talk up, and I do think that Tigrayans should be able to talk up and have these healthy conversations, and people that people shouldn't be afraid to say, I don't stand with either side. I don't believe that this side is doing right, and I don't believe this side is doing right. Or saying, or having nuanced opinions and saying, yeah, the TPLF is doing right in X, Y, and Z. Getachew is doing right on A, B, and C. But, you know, they're doing wrong on these other areas. And I think those nuanced conversations should be encouraged. And I was hopeful and hoping that, and I think that's what allowed me to come back. I am hopeful now that those conversations with the upcoming generation are able to be had. They may not be facilitated by older generations. They may not be facilitated by current political leaders, but there is a future for Tigray. Regardless, like, life will continue and to go on. And people just have to, I think people just have to start being brave. And that's why I wanted to come on. Like, I wanted to break my silence and hopefully spark some kind of, you know, belief in some people, or plant a seed, or, you know, ignite some people that have got these brighter ideas, that are far more intelligent than I am, have got much more of a nuanced, you know, opinion, to actually come out and share them. And, you know, because if you don't do it, like, the payoff is Tigray will disintegrate. Like, it will dissolve. It will disappear into nothingness. It was so close. Like, I think had the war in some ways not happened, the next 2 or 3 generations, you might have been seeing Tigrinya very, very, very little. You know, like, the process of elimination was happening. Like, people, even in Tigray, when I would go, I want to learn Tigrinya, I don't want to learn Amharic. From an Ethiopian perspective, that really upset a lot of people. But even in Tigray, some people would say, but it's easier, just speak Amharic, it's easier than Tigrinya. So, like, people were already willing to let go of their identity and mold into Ethiopian identity. And I think if this generation is serious about maintaining their identity, these conversations need to be had now. The culture needs to be preserved now. And I think if me coming out and saying, look, try and take yourself out of the narratives and the propaganda and the ideologies, and if that sparks that in someone, that's why I wanted to come back and talk again, because I think it's on the brink of extinction, and it can be reignited, the identity can be reignited and preserved. Or if it keeps going down this pathway, it very, very quickly may be dissolved.
Well, and talky should, Kasech. And I think the stuff that people say about white savior complex or whatever, it is deeply misplaced, because I think fundamentally ideas should be judged on their merit, whether they were said by a white person or a black person or a brown person. Color shouldn't come into, it shouldn't be a factor.
But it is, unfortunately, in this world at the moment.
Yeah, and also I think there is an element of double standard as well. I mean, Ethiopians or Tigrayans don't mind opining about Australian or American politics, but when somebody from the US or from Australia gives commentary on Tigrayan politics, I don't think there is that sort of hostility in Tigray. I think it's more an Ethiopian problem. Then all of a sudden they say hands off Ethiopia and all that. And I think it's deeply misplaced. You know, you are as deeply invested in Tigray as anybody I know, and you have every right to give your commentary on Ethiopia. And I'm happy that you have decided to come on here today and do that. And finally, Kasech, one of the debates in Tigray today is, what is the way out? How do we get out of this malaise? What should we do? And there are many perspectives, as you will have noticed, of course. There are people who say that we should just throw in the towel now and give in and let everything hit rock bottom and see what comes out of that. There are people who say that we should try to salvage something from the Pretoria Agreement. We should create some sort of united front in Tigray and push for an implementation of the agreement that benefits Tigray. And there are various other kinds of perspectives in between. And I'm just wondering if we could end with you giving us your reflections of what you think should happen, or what you think we should be pushing towards, given the circumstances we're in today.
I think it's hard to comment on where things are today, because I don't think I've consolidated my thoughts on that properly. One thing about the Pretoria Agreement, though, is I think the terms of it should be renegotiated. I think the agreement itself is fundamentally flawed. I think that TPLF has been incorrect in saying implement the full Pretoria Agreement, because the full Pretoria Agreement essentially says that the federal powers will maintain and control Tigray. So in a sense, they're kind of pushing for an agreement that would actually push them out even further, if that's what they want. If they want to set, and if in that case they are ready to have it fully implemented, well, then why not step down and move aside now? Like, if that's what they want. So I don't think pushing this idea that implement the agreement is correct. I think let's renegotiate the agreement and look at the terms of it. I think that's evident. It can't be implemented, or it hasn't been implemented, regardless of whether Abiy wants it to or not. Like, Abiy doesn't care. He just wants his image and his money to be maintained. That's why I believe sorry, I've digressed again, but it was so easy for him to outsell Fano and Eritrea. He didn't care about, I don't necessarily think he cares so much about the war. I don't think he's a warmonger, but like I said, war was a means to an end rather than his deep value and his drive. The war, very much for his eyes, from my understanding, was a very deep drive to erase Tigrayans from the face of the earth. Same with the Fano. So I don't think renegotiating would be impossible with him, because so long as he gets essentially what he wants, it's not going to be impossible. Whether I think he should get what he wants and have full control of Tigray and have Tigray part of, I don't believe in that. Like, personally, like, my very, very, very deep belief and hope would be that Tigray could make it on its own. Like, I've studied the empire, I've looked at Ethiopia, and I just don't believe in it anymore. I've made that clear. But again, that's just my belief. It's not up to me to make a decision. That's just what I think. So that for me would be the end goal. Tigray could become some kind of Singapore of Africa, in some sense. That's my dream. It's got nothing to do with me. That's the people's choice. That's what I want the people to, decide on their own. So the way out, allow the people to have their voices heard. What do they want? What do they need? Focusing the resources or focusing policy on actually, once there is some kind of stable leadership, like reinstating the justice system. I have a friend's brother who's been in prison for, I think 6 months for something that he wasn't, they don't have any evidence. He's accused of a crime that he didn't do. And I'm sure if there's one person who this is impacting, there is thousands of them that are being, so focusing on the things that can, whoever is in charge, focusing on those things that can actually improve the everyday lives of the people. I don't know. It's hard because I'm an idealist and I have beliefs and dreams and hopes, but they're not necessarily always grounded in the reality, like the fiscal reality. Tigray has no money at the moment. But, the focus for me should always be the farmers are getting infrastructure. Like, this is one of the core problems that I had with the, pre-war TPLF is, well, how can you have a society that is built on farming, but you have no water or piping and irrigation systems to actually support the farms? So, these things. And I think these conversations and ideas and policies can be written and, can be done now for preparation for when there is a transition of power into the hands of the next generation. Maybe there's nothing we can do today that will change for today, but I think there are steps that can be taken so the future, because at the end of the day, these people will pass on. The people who are in charge will get older and it will need to eventually go into the hands of the next generation. So again, this was put on the spot, but I guess my final thought would be preparing for the future, like writing the policies, planning things out. I had this idea that maybe after the war there could be a system in Tigray where, because I didn't think it's ever right to completely erase TPLF from the identity of Tigray. I don't think you can, because the TPLF was made of people's fathers. It was freedom fighters that built that. But, and there is wisdom to be learned. So I had this idea that maybe in Ethiopia you've got the president and the prime minister's office. maybe the president's office could be made from members of the, the TPLF, if that was an organization that was continued, or actually legitimize it as a part of history, but also an ongoing part, but allowing the actual congressional and the state and the Senate, and the House of Representatives, or are they the terms that we use in Ethiopia? If those, the actual representatives of the people came from different political parties, like that's just an idea that I had that I've thrown out, and I've thought about for a while. I'm like, that would pay respect and homage to the survivors and the heroes of the past, because the organization itself, would be able to advise on certain things because it would hold maybe the president's seat, but the actual people, because in Australia, for example, we don't have a president, but we have a representative of the Queen, who is our Governor General, who acts as that third leg of government. So they don't have much power, but they're there in case things, very similar to the president, the idea of a president in Ethiopia. I think planning for the future, an exit plan. Like, I had a manager once say to me, as a manager, your job is to prepare your next, who's going to replace you. Your number one job is to prepare the person who will replace you. I think Melis very clearly failed in that. He didn't prepare anyone. He maybe thought he was going to live a lot longer than he did, and so the transition could never happen. But I think intellectuals that don't want to buy into the rhetoric, don't want to buy into the narratives, don't want to buy into the emotions, don't want to take sides, they have the ability to start planning for what is the next step and the way out, and preparing. No one's preparing them, but they prepare their own future. I don't know. Maybe I'm too hopeful. Maybe I'm too dreamy and kept alive by dreams. But I do think that there are things that can be done, and I said that during the war as well. Like, plan. I'm not good at really following through what I'm doing and actually putting plans into place, but strategically, I can think and outside of the square, and that's what I would suggest. Like, have your debates, have your arguments, have your conversations about how you will preserve Tigray and how you will build it when the opportunity comes.
I mean, you mentioned hope, and I think it's always good, if for nothing as for your own sanity. But whatever the merits and demerits of preserving the TPLF, I think the one significant problem is that it's self-emulating, and it might be that there is nothing people could do to preserve it. That could actually be the problem. But I just want to make one point about the agreement, because you said that one of the things that should be done is that the terms of the agreement should be renegotiated. And I think that's a very, very good point. And we say that the agreement is generally rubbish. But one positive aspect of the agreement, of the clauses of the agreement, is that there is a provision actually for renegotiating the terms of the agreement.
Yeah,
but the problem
exactly.
is that for that to happen, there should be a functioning political system in Tigray, a political system that has a unity of purpose, and that is in a position to be able to push the mediators to facilitate that process of renegotiation. And one wonders whether the current paralysis in Tigray, whether that is possible.
I don't. Yeah. Again, because these are parts of the conversation that I miss because I don't understand Tigrinya properly and fluently. So I don't have any opinions or thoughts on Tadessa Wareda at the moment, because I don't know what he said, and I don't know what he's promised, and I don't know what he's capable of. I don't know who he is as a person. With Getachew, I had an idea, at least, of his personality, because he was so flamboyant, he was so open, he was so scathing of Abiy, that, I kind of aligned to him and thought, I like this person. He's bold, he's brave, he's ready to do, make change. I don't know now. For me, he's changed, and he's not the same person that he was. And people change, and their alignment changes. So I don't know what is possible. And I'm still very, very unclear on some of these minor details, because I did remove myself so much, conversations around the mining and the gold and then this and that. I've got the general picture, but I don't know the truth in between any of this. And I think this is one part where social media is missing it. Like, people are proclaiming to be experts on things that they're not experts in. And I think that, I think the thing that really frustrates me, and I'll take it back to humility and values, is from a Christian society that, values humility. Most people raised in an environment where they don't showboat and they don't pretend, like they're not encouraged to, tell people that they're the best and that they know better. But yet on social media, for some reason, that is coming out in people's personalities, and it's kind of it's sad, because I feel like when you're doing that, you're actually taking away parts of you that, were the value systems that you were raised in. And are you really actually representing Tigray and what it means to be Tigrayan, or are you just representing yourself and your ego and your hurt? So yeah, if you can rise above that and think outside of that, and I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how you can negotiate terms when people are so emotionally invested and not looking at things from a pragmatic perspective.
Yeah, and so gripped by daily events, and there is a flood of daily propaganda from Addis Ababa, deliberately designed to keep Tigrayans busy, shouting at one another over issues that are of absolutely no relevance.
Yeah, and that's what Abiy has done. That's how he's maintained his grip to power. He's divided the societies very, very neatly. And he's winning in Tigray. And I think I said this in one of my few posts this year. Abiy only wins if you let him win. And people are letting him win. People are falling for his tricks and his games when once they saw them for what they were. Maybe they saw them for what they were because Getachew was the one calling them out, and nobody's necessarily doing that anymore. If you call out Abiy, you are accused of being with TPLF, so why call out Abiy? It's become that kind of divisive. But again, that's social media. So I don't know what's on the ground. Like, from an on the ground perspective, it might be different. The politicians might not be going into all of that. Maybe I'm just looking at social media and reacting to what's actually happening on the ground, because I haven't been able to go back yet.
There's always that risk of relying too much on social media, but that's the best we can do from where we are, Kasech. But before we conclude, I was just wondering if you might have some final thoughts, because like I said before, you have a good vantage point. You are able to see things not from the point of view of somebody who is trying to advance partisan interests, but from somebody who could see the whole picture and who could give opinions that might be beneficial to the entirety of Tigray, to all political parties. Mm-hmm. So if you have some things that you think you could say, I would really appreciate that.
On the spot again. I think I've said a lot of what I would probably want to say to them, like thinking outside the square, thinking for the future, planning for the future, looking at lessons learnt around the world. Tigray is not the only society that's had to be built from nothing, but also just recognizing, and I don't want to be like, oh, I'm Australian, so look at my country's the best. I'm actually, I'm Hungarian, so ethnically I don't relate to being Australian. My family's all new. But the model that they took and the way they developed, like, Australia was discovered from the Western sense around the same time Johannes was around. So it's quite relatively recent in history. Like, that's Johannes. It's not long ago that he was trying to, build his version of Tigray. And the English landed. If you've ever been to Australia, if you actually look at the wilderness that was in front of them, they were able to build something very, very quickly and very remarkably. And I don't think, you can do all of that. But I think, taking examples from around the world, not ridiculous to say, but taking colonial examples of how they built things and actually applying what was successful, what actually allowed them to build these societies in a successful manner, and how can we replicate that in Tigray? Because we're starting from essentially the same spot, but we have the benefit that we are going to get to do this for our own people. We're not being colonized, and an idea is not being forced upon us. But what ideas can we take from these societies that have sprung up from Singapore? Like, what ideas can we take to actually build our society in an image that is going to benefit our growth, maintain our culture, maintain our values, and protect our identity. And I think for me, that's the only message that I really have for those intellects that actually do have a say and do have a way forward. Like, think outside of the square, close the noise, ignore the emotional jabs from Addis Ababa, the propaganda machines. Like, it sounds conspiracy, but it is real. Like, I've noticed a few comments, there's only a few that have come back now that I started to critique Getachew. Getachew's on Abby's team. They're the exact same accounts that were attacking me for attacking Abby, for saying anything against Amhara. Like, there are people that are paid to do this on social media. So, ignore that. Like, try to ignore that. If you've got a master's degree, if you've got a doctorate, use your skill set to look at how you can actually implement. If you're going to return, especially from the diaspora, and you really want Tigray to grow, look at how you can use your skills to actually better the society. And Tech, like, I would say you're doing that already. Like, you're already continually, you're setting the example in being engaged and allowing a forum for people to continue to openly talk and to critique and put their ideas out. And I think I'd just like to see courage from the diaspora, especially, like, maybe inside Tigray, of course inside Tigray as well, because they're the people that are living this hell. They're the people that are living through all of this. But put your education to use. Like, you were given it for a reason. I know there's not job opportunities, but looking at how you can build opportunities for yourself, or build, it depends. I guess at some point as well, people just want to live their own lives, hey? And they just want to make the best of their own life. They don't want to always be dealt with politics and with, big thinking, big picture thinking. But if you are that way inclined, use your skills and your education to plan for a future that could be built in Tigray's image. Have hope.
Amen to that. Amen to that. And thank you for coming on to that and sharing with our viewers your insightful views, Kasech. And I hope that the situation in Tigray and in Ethiopia will change for the better soon enough for you to feel safe enough to go and travel. And
I don't know it. I've gone and said a few more things bad about Abby again. So who knows? I might be on the blacklist again for another 6 months.
I think I have said a lot of things about Abby, and I was able to go, and I didn't have any problem. But maybe
it could very much just be paranoia, and also my mum's fear. She's scared. Don't go.
But at any rate, I hope that things will change, and they have to change, because the situation is so desperate that if things don't change, it's going to be extremely difficult for people, not just in Tigray, but outside Ethiopia. So I sense that change is coming anyway, out of necessity. But thank you very much for today, Kasech.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the space to talk.